It was easy to get lost in the 1980s and 1990s in Los Angeles. The city was rife with turmoil, and entire neighborhoods sunk deep into decrepit disrepair from the ongoing crack epidemic. Crime rates and homelessness were high, higher than residents had ever seen them before. For many, the future looked bleak. It was little surprise to find women assaulted and murdered, especially in neighborhoods that were known to harbor drug dealers and desperate, oftentimes homeless, sex workers. Case after case of murdered women piled up high on top of detectives' desks, usually only to be filed away and forgotten about when the next one came in. But some of that changed in 1998 when 41-year-old Paula Vance was killed. Unlike many of the women who'd come before her, Paula's brutal assault and death by strangulation were all caught on security camera. Unfortunately, her assailant remained a blurry, shadowy figure in the footage. Detective Cliff Shepard was put on the case, a case that would make a lasting impression on him. But with only a little amount of DNA evidence and unclear images to go on, he had very little to work with. In 2001, when he transferred to the LAPD's new cold case unit, he carried with him the images of Paula's final moments in his heart and mind, right up to the labs within the department. It took a while for the case to gain some traction, but DNA evidence collected from Paula's scene came back with a match for 2 other incidents. Mildred Beasley had been a 45-year-old homemaker on her way home to see some friends in 1996 when she was assaulted and strangled. Her body had been left behind in some bushes on the side of a freeway. The other match, however, came back from a far more recent case. In 2002, 47-year-old Maria Martinez, who sold cigarettes outside a homeless shelter, was approached by a man. He asked her for a lighter for his crack pipe before dragging her to a deserted parking lot. There, he assaulted her for over 2 hours. His victim managed to escape once, but was caught. But when she escaped again, she managed to break away and get to the police. She led them right back to the homeless shelter where the police found her assailant, hiding, fully clothed, inside the showers. His name was Chester Turner. Chester had been born in Arkansas in 1966, but had moved to Los Angeles with his mother when he was 5 after his parents' divorce. Like so many others around him, Chester Turner fell through the cracks. He lived with his mother, going from her house, her father's house, and prison for petty crimes of theft and drug possession until his mother left town for Utah. After that, Chester went from unreliable and unstable homes back to prison and onto homeless shelters or Skid Row. He'd once managed to find work at a Domino's Pizza, but by 2002, he'd mainly worked as a security guard for the homeless shelter he was currently hiding in. When the police found him in the showers that day, he was a burly 6'2" man with scars across his face. He pled guilty to the charges of rape, the first violent crime that would go on his already lengthy record, and would be followed by many, many more. It was his DNA that matched with the one found at Paula Vance's scene, and told the investigators that there could be more of Chester's victims hiding within their system. They tested everything they could, dragging more results out of the already backlogged labs of the LAPD. Still on the case, Detective Cliff Shepard talked about the chilling year that followed, one that he later said seemed to get a new hit every month. Chester was linked to the murders of 10 women and an additional 4 that would come up as testing continued. Many of these women were assaulted and strangled during the initial weeks that Chester would be released from prison after serving his sentences for petty crimes, usually after he'd been released early. His first set of victims came from 1987 and 1989. In 1987, motorists along Harbor Freeway spotted the body of 21-year-old Diane Johnson on the side of the road. She was partially nude, had been assaulted, and then strangled. After Diane was 33-year-old Alondra Joyce Bunn. She'd been badly beaten, suffered lacerations to her face and neck, and had bloody eyes. She was found partially nude on top of a pile of trash. Next was 26-year-old Annette Ernest. She was also found partially nude and strangled, then dumped on a dirt shoulder of Grand Avenue. From there were no matches to Chester Turner's DNA from 1988, but the killings began again in 1989. In January of that year, the body of 31-year-old Anita Fishman Breyer was discovered outside of a garage off Figueroa Street. She'd struggled with drug addictions and homelessness, making her an easy target for a man who by that point had become used to stalking the streets. Later that year, the partially nude body of 27-year-old Regina Nadine Washington was discovered inside a garage of that very same Figueroa Street. Like many of the others, she'd been assaulted and strangled, but Regina's case came with some new chilling circumstances. Regina had been 6 months pregnant at the time of her murder. Her baby, later referred to as Baby Washington, had died inside the womb, a direct result of the death of its mother. The authorities believed that Regina's homicide was not one murder, but two, and added the death of Baby Washington to Chester Turner's growing list of charges. Only a month later, 25-year-old Desiree Ella Mae Jones was found in the backyard of a vacant residence on Estrella Avenue. She'd also struggled with drug addictions, but was described by those close to her as smart, outgoing, and funny. She worked at a home for the elderly. 1995 saw the final spree of assaults and killings. 31-year-old Natalie Joan Price had briefly left her friend's house to look for a jacket she'd lost earlier that day. She never returned and was instead found near a vacant residence on Vermont Knolls after she'd been strangled to death. The next year, 45-year-old Mildred Williams Beasley was killed after her husband dropped her off to visit friends. She'd left behind a teenage son. In 1997, it was 31-year-old Cynthia Johnson. She was found strangled to death in Green Meadows, and her murder was followed a year later by the woman who, in many ways, was the key to untangling this long chain of assault and brutal killings. In 1998, 38-year-old Paula Donnell Vance was found behind a local business. Almost unbelievably, a total of 5 security cameras caught portions of her final moments between them, but never a clear image of the man who'd killed her. One camera that managed to capture a lot of the assault in great detail would have clearly shown her killer's face, but cut away only moments before he came into frame. Paula was, in many ways, Chester's perfect victim. She'd suffered from mental illness and was homeless. She went from place to place, sleeping wherever she could find a place to lay her head, and didn't have anyone watching out for her. Until Detective Cliff Shepard saw the footage of her murder. After that, Chester temporarily got away with one more murder, the murder of 39-year-old Brenda Bryce. She was found strangled to death in a porta potty only 50 yards away from the hotel that Chester was living in at the time. DNA evidence named Chester as the culprit, and he was taken to court for her murder. He was serving 8 years in the Sierra Conservation Center for the rape of Maria Martinez when Chester Turner was charged with 10 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty and was taken to court while 4 more charges of murder came in. Chester now faced one trial of 10 murders and an additional 4, but he maintained his innocence. His defense argued that Chester had known and had been in contact with the victims because he sold them drugs. His DNA had been left on them and at the scenes because many of these women had offered to pay for their drugs with sexual favors instead of money. The courts disagreed and found Chester guilty at his first trial. He was then sentenced to death for his crimes. He was found guilty again at the second trial, taking his official charges up to 11 counts of murder. He received another death sentence. A lengthy and difficult journey of appeals began after that, coming all the way up to 2020, where the courts reviewed his sentences. His conviction for the murder of Baby Washington was overturned, but his sentence for the murder of his other 14 victims was upheld. He currently sits on death row in San Quentin State Prison, awaiting his execution. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen to 10-Minute Murder. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do that, joe@10minutemurder.com. You can also go to the website there and find everything you need to know about the show. places to listen, social media links, all that stuff is at 10minutemurder.com. And an email from one of you listening. Hello, Joe. My name is Roxanne, but I usually go by Rox. I'm wondering, you've done this podcast for a while now, and I love it. But are there times when you're like, I just don't have the energy for this today, or struggle with self-doubt? I know it's a strange question, but I'm just curious. Rox in Charlotte. Thank you, Rox, for the email. And the answer is, yeah, I'm a normal human being. There are absolutely days when I don't want to do the podcast. That's mostly because the topic is so heavy that I need a little mental vacation from time to time. And the self-doubt? Absolutely. You're listening to a guy that can't spell restaurant without the aid of spell check. I'm pretty self-deprecating anyway, so on those days when I'm struggling a bit mentally, I do wonder why many of you choose to listen to this dummy talk about true crime. And not that you ask, but let me give you a huge reason why I actually do this podcast. I do it because, in my weird way, this is how I can shine a spotlight on the mental health crisis that exists, not just here in America, but all over the place. For so many years, the stigma of being mentally unwell was kind of a taboo subject. If it was bad enough, your family would plop you into a special home or hospital so that they didn't have to deal with you. They were embarrassed by you. So if you were a person that tiptoes the line of being mentally unwell, you kept that stuff inside. You kept it to yourself until one day you might crack. What's going on with the mental health crisis today, it's not perfect, but I believe it's getting better. And if you're listening to me right now and you know that you're struggling with your mental health and it's unchecked, I hope that you will seek help. So if you've noticed an underlying theme to most of these episodes of 10 Minute Murder, it's mental illness or being raised by abusive or absent parents or guardians. And thanks for coming to my TED Talk. That's it. That's your episode for today. If you're off to binge more, go right ahead. And thanks for listening to 10 Minute Murder.